In this video, I want to take some time to talk about refactoring. Refactoring is the process of restructuring your code without changing its external behavior. So that means we would change the code in here without changing what happens over inside of the actual application. Now that might seem like a whole lot of work for literally no payoff. So far, every time we've gone through a video, we've added some sort of new feature, and that's great. But at some point, your code gets to the point where it starts to look a little bit bloated. We add new features in where they make sense, but after a little while, we've added so many new features in that it's actually a little hard to understand what this file does. So what we're going to do is figure out how we can refactor and better structure the code we already have. That's going to make it super easy and fun to actually add on more features. The process of refactoring is one of those things that really only makes sense after you actually see someone go through the process and you can see the real advantages. So we're going to be focusing on two big picture things. The first thing we're going to do is set up another JavaScript file for our application so we don't have all of our code in one place. And the second thing we're going to do is abstract specific features out into function calls. For example, what do we do right here? We do a single thing. We get the saved notes. So we can abstract all of this code into a single function, replacing it with a single function call. We also have other instances where we can do just that, and we're going to break it out into maybe about 5 or 6 different functions. So let's go ahead and kick things off by creating a second JavaScript file for the Notes application. To simplify what we're working with, I'm just going to close down the to-do app files. Don't worry though, we will be performing very similar refactoring for that app. Well, I should actually say you'll be performing it. Now over in the Notes app directory, I'm going to make a new JavaScript file, and I'll call this something like notes-functions.js. And in here, we're going to end up just defining some functions that get used by the other JavaScript file. Let's go ahead and actually run this file by creating a second script tag. Now I'm going to add this script tag right here above my previous one. So another script tag. We're going to use the source attribute to load an external script in, and I'm going to call this one notes-functions.js. Now, never before have we had two files in a single web page, so there are a few things I want to talk about. The first important thing to note is that all of your files share a single global namespace. So I have a notes array over here. That notes array isn't specific to just this file. It's specific to all files in my application. So to prove something, which I'll talk about in a second, let's go ahead and actually add a console.log call in. And what I'm going to do is try to print the filters object. The filters object clearly being defined elsewhere in a JavaScript file, but both are loaded in to the HTML. Now, what do you think is going to print for this log? Well, if we check out the browser, we can actually see we get a reference error. Filters is not defined. So what's happening here? What's happening here is that our JavaScript files are running in order. So the order they appear in the script tag is the order in which they execute. So when notes functions runs, it's trying to access filters. Filters is not created until later on when the notes app file runs. So if we were to switch the order of the script tags, things would work as expected. To prove that, let's change nothing else but the order of the script tags. I'm going to save the markup, and over here, we can now see we're getting the filters object printing. So when we're working with multiple JavaScript files, it is important to pay attention to the order in which you load them in. Now for our purposes, we are going to move that functions file up to the top of the list, and that's because this is where we're going to define some functions, and the functions are going to get used over inside of the app.js file. Now let's actually make this file useful. The first thing that we're going to refactor is this code right here. The job of this code is to fetch the data from local storage, see if any exists, and then if it does, parse it. That's 3 steps. Read it, check it, parse it. We're never going to perform one of those steps without also performing the other 2. So this is a great example of something that can be broken out into a single simple function call. And we're actually going to take things one step further. So let's go ahead and start by taking the code we're trying to refactor and just cutting it out of the file from wherever it currently lives. Now remember, the goal is to not change the behavior at all. So what we're going to do is add a function over in the notes functions file. I'm going to leave a quick comment for this function, just describing what it does. This one is going to read existing notes from local storage. Now let's go ahead and actually define the function, const, and I'm going to call this one get saved notes. And this one isn't going to take any arguments. Its job is going to be exactly what we had done before. Now, we can't just take this code and paste it in and save it, because there are things that no longer make sense. For example, this function actually tries to set notes. Notes isn't going to exist. So what we're going to do instead is just have it return the parsed data. Whoever happens to call the function will be able to access the parsed data via the return value. Now, what we're going to do is also add on an else clause. If there is no data when we fetch it from local storage, we're going to start you off with an empty array, which we're currently doing. So I am going to return an empty array. So by making a few small tweaks to this code, we now have something that's much more useful. I'm going to remove the comment since this comment no longer makes sense. We already have one up above describing the function, and we're going to save this file and actually use get saved notes. Over here, where are we going to put that? Well, we actually aren't going to put it right here. We can actually replace the empty array declaration from up above and simply set notes equal to whatever comes back from calling get saved notes. Now we can actually change notes back over to a constant since we no longer need to reassign its value. And there we go. We have our first refactor completed. We were able to pull a bunch of lines of code out of the app file, replacing it with just a single function call. So if I was trying to scan this file and figure out how things work, I could say, okay, I'm getting the saved notes. If I cared about the details, I could always go over to the function and see exactly how it works. So this is going to allow us to create applications that have more reusable code. We can call this function multiple times if we need to, and they're also going to be a lot easier to work with and maintain. So this is just one example. Let's go ahead and first test that our refactor didn't break anything, and then we'll move on to refactoring more stuff. In this case, I am still getting my unnamed notes showing up, so we know that everything is still working as expected. The notes array is correctly getting set using this new technique. Now what we're going to focus on is some of the code down below. There is a whole lot of code sitting in here. We're actually going to break this out into 3 separate function calls. First up is going to be the code down below. Down below, we use a few different lines of code to actually generate the DOM elements, in this case just element, a paragraph, for each note item. All of this code could be broken out into just a single function call, something like generate note DOM. And that's exactly what we're going to end up doing. So let's go ahead and take all of this code and cut it out. Now we're actually not going to cut out the last line, just these lines right here. I'm going to add them to the clipboard. I'm going to switch over to notes functions, and we're going to create this new function. Now let's also set up a comment for this one, something like generate the DOM structure for a note, and then we'll set up a const, which can be a function. I'll call this one generate note DOM equals a function, and this one is going to take in an argument. We're going to take in the note data, and then we are going to generate the DOM element. Now in this case, we are accessing variables that are in scope. We create note element, we use it a couple of times, we also use note a couple of times. That's going to end up getting passed in. So the only thing we need to do in order to get this function to work is to return the new node. So I'm going to return the note element. Now we have this function that we can call as many times as we need for every single note. To set this call up, all we're going to do over here is use the following: const note element equals, and then we call the function we just defined, generate note DOM. Now we do pass in note, and there we have it. So now when someone's scanning this file to try to figure out how the application works, or we're working on our own project adding new features, we'll be able to see that right here for each note. All we do is we generate the DOM node and then we add it in. Now, if you care about the details of that DOM node, that's fine. Sometimes we do need to care about the details. All you have to do is go over here, find the function, you can look at exactly how the DOM node is generated, and you could change the code should you be adding a feature related to this functionality. So by breaking out all of these functions, we're going to clean things up quite a bit, abstracting everything into little discrete actions: get saved notes, generate DOM node. Now we're going to go ahead and continue to do this. What I want to take a moment to pull out is render notes. Now render notes, luckily for us, is already a function call because we had used it multiple times. So all we really need to do is take all of this code, cut it out, and bring it over to the other file. Over inside of the notes functions file, I'm going to leave a quick comment, render, application notes. Then I'm just going to paste the function in. So now we have our functions set up in the functions file. We have their usages over here in the notes app file. And now we have a notes app file that's actually very easy to reason about. I could scan this in maybe 30 seconds and get at a high level how the application works. Now it's important to make sure that we haven't broken anything. Over here, everything does still look good. We are getting our list of notes rendered, which means that we were able to successfully call both of those functions. So there we have it. A little bit of refactoring goes a long way towards creating a code base that's a bit more maintainable and easier to work with. Now it's important to note that the goal of refactoring is to not reduce your project to as few lines of code as possible. If that were the case, we wouldn't be using functions at all and our code would be a mess. It would technically work, but it would be almost impossible to change and add new features to because it would be so complex and chaotic. The goal with refactoring is to take your existing features and actually break them out into something a bit more reasonable. So we could take this even further if we wanted to, and how far you take it is really up to your own personal preference. So for example, I might decide that I want to abstract away the fact that I'm using local storage at all. So I'm going to replace just this one line with a function call. So right here, I could cut out this line, and I could bring it over into the notes functions file. Let's say that I create a new function right here. I'll leave a comment for this one, save the notes to local storage. And then I can set up a function, something like save notes. This one is going to take an argument. It's going to take in the notes to save, and all we're going to do is paste in that one line. Now, each individual person is going to feel differently about this refactor. You might say, hey, that seems a bit unnecessary, or you might say, you know what, I like the fact that I can just call save notes over here and not need to worry about the implementation details. I do not care what save notes does. I call it, I pass the data, and we're done. So later on, if I did want to switch storage mechanisms, all I would need to do is change a bit of code in these two functions. I actually wouldn't need to touch this file at all because it's not concerned with the details. It's concerned with the high-level functionality. That's where we're going to stop for this one. In the next video, you're going to be doing a bit of refactoring for the to-do application all on your own. We set up multiple JavaScript files for the Notes app, and we also broke out our code into function calls, making things easier to expand on and maintain. I'm excited to get to the next video, so let's go ahead and jump right in.